To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, comparing themes between ancient cultures and ancient civilizations lost and found. And I, of course, am one of the highly caffeinated characters that you hear frequently on this podcast, Micah Hanks. James Waldo also in the house. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I got to tell you, though, it's taken me about, pretty much till Thursday to get rested up from our adventures this last week.
That's right. I'm also eager to hear how saving best for last Mr. Jason Pentrail is feeling. Are you all recovered there, sir?
I am indeed, and as you are caffeinated, I'm winding down, not with a Guinness this time, because I know that we've had an upset listener because we talked too much about Guinness. So tonight I am having a Sierra Nevada Southern Gothic, my friends. That's an unfiltered Pils.
An unfiltered Pils. I enjoy those from time to time, and I'm sure that you could probably enjoy that at its freshest right here in Ash Vegas. Jason, while you were up here last fall, I took you out to the Sierra Nevada Brewery, and that's something I'm really looking forward to doing with James Waldo. You know, you're gonna have to see that facility. It's incredible. But there are a few others here in Asheville that I want to take you guys to at some point when you're up here. The closest one to my house, and the funny thing is, over the weekend when we were down in South Carolina assisting our friends in archaeology, many of them were asking about Highland Brewing because that's kind of the first regional microbrewery that kind of came on the scene in Asheville, and they kind of market themselves as being Asheville's first brewery. And they make some fine beer, but somebody was asking me about that and whether I ever went to that brewery, and I said, I've been there, I think, twice, and yet it is actually the second closest brewery to where I live. Why I don't go there more is a mystery of time and space, friends.
Yeah, that's one of those things about proximity. I live down here in Savannah, and there's a ton of great places to go to, but I've got my favorites, and there's people like, do you ever go here or there? I've been there a couple of times. I can't argue with that.
The closest place to my house, and again, a place I haven't taken you guys, is what's called the Whistle Hop Brewery. Not Whistle Stop, but Whistle Hop, right? And they have some brewing that they do there on site, but then they also offer a variety of other things from the region. And a nice little place, but as the name entails, it is actually a caboose from a train that they have repurposed and turned into a brewery with a nice outdoor area. I love to go up there and read Herodotus.
That's interesting. There's a guy, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he used to work where I work with the Corps of Engineers, a geologist, and he quit the Corps of Engineers to open a brewery in Savannah. And it's been about, I'd say it's probably about 4 years ago, I guess. And the name of the brewery is Coastal Empire. And I think there was a little struggle to start with, but they're actually doing quite well. So you guys come down this way, maybe we'll swing over there and say hi.
Sounds like a fun time. Jason, didn't you also say there's a little brewery right up the road from you where you live down there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's actually a couple. There's one 5 minutes around the corner, and then there's another one maybe 15 minutes up in town. But yeah, they're both pretty good. They both got some really decent stuff. And the thing that's funny about them is they're so family friendly now. I mean, you see people out there with their children, and they all serve a lot of really good food and bar food and things like that. So yeah, it's came a long ways over the last few years.
Well, that is a new phenomena here in America, that with the brew pub culture, it's a very family-friendly environment. People are out there. You always see that in Nashville at the breweries. People sitting down, especially on Sunday afternoons, mom and dad having a beer, the kids running around, they've got their dog. I mean, and sometimes it's several generations all hanging out together. But, if you think about this historically speaking, that's not necessarily a new phenomena. I think that's kind of a holdover from the temperance movement and also prohibition. And in the United States, we've had to kind of catch up to the idea that, oh, wow, drinking a moderate amount of alcohol in front of our children is an okay thing to do in public. And I think that that's actually healthier. This is my personal opinion, because you look at, parts of the world like Germany where a 5-year-old could go into a store and buy beer for their parents and bring it home, and they might even be served a little bit. It's a cultural thing, and that sort of demystifies that. And therefore, I feel that, again, having that as a part of the culture, and it's not some sort of a taboo thing, you might say is healthier, because it could be a deterrent to alcoholism and abuse of that substance later in life. Now, I'm sure not everyone would agree with that, but there have been those questions raised, over the years about the cultural influence of alcohol. So for me, I would say that I think that seeing a family-oriented environment where, again, not drinking to extremes, but instead just sitting down, enjoying time with family, and maybe having a beer while the kids run around. I think that's a really healthy environment and a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, let's just think while we were talking is, maybe we should do a show about the prohibition movement and temperance and the whole thing that led to prohibition, and then how we came out of prohibition. Not necessarily talking about, organized crime and all that, but just the political side of it.
Well, that would be interesting. And also, of course, guys, the longer history, and that's what I'm getting at. The cultural phenomena that is consumption of alcohol. If you look back through history, many people would say that, it has been more of a cultural influence. Some would go so far as to say that alcohol could have actually been, in many ways, the root of culture and the root of a lot of traditions and ideas going back to the ancient past. Again, that's very fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Me too.
Well, as we know, alcohol consumption is nothing new. It is certainly one of the oldest things in history. And something else that's nothing new is standing around a campfire in the middle of the night with friends and talking about where we're at, how we got here, and most importantly, where we came from. And we recently had that opportunity over the last weekend to share some time, some conversation with some great folks on 2 different archaeology sites throughout the Southeast. And that would explain why we are somewhat tired and a little bit ragged, but all now in full recovery mode.
That's right. Spending good times with the archaeologists of the Southeast. Over the last few days, we were able to spend some time with one of my very favorite people, Dr. Christopher Moore. We also got to spend some great time with Chris Young, another one of my favorite guys who does CRM work. We finally got to meet Chris Judge. You may begin to notice here that there are a lot of guys named Chris who work in archaeology in the Southeast. Chris Cottrell was one of our actual roommates over the weekend. He, of course, of the Dabbler's Den YouTube channel. Chris Corley, who is a wonderfully talented avocationalist and who spent some time with us before. Yeah, a lot of people named Chris involved in Southeastern archaeology. It was hard to keep tabs of everybody. Thank goodness Dan showed up, and finally there was a guy there whose name wasn't Chris.
Yeah, and I think I told Dan and Chris, and probably all the Chris's while we were out there, is we showed up to White Pond. Chris Corley was there, and he was there because he was a fan of the show, and I guess it was really one of the first times where I ran into a fan who knew who I was before we even shook hands, and it was kind of an experience for me, I guess you could say.
It's unusual, and the same thing happened at SWAG. We met a lot of great people, listeners of the show, people who had been following us for quite a while and were very aware of what we do. But there's so much to take in. It was such a busy weekend. Micah and I ended up at 2 sites. James, unfortunately, was only able to join us at White Pond, but nonetheless, so much knowledge was shared, so many conversations, just goes on and on and on. And mostly because it was fellowship. There was lots of people there. There was music going on. So ultimately, we had great conversations, great times with everyone. And I can't say enough about the professionalism, the opportunities that were afforded us to be there. So we certainly want to thank all the organizers for letting us take part. And we certainly have plenty of material to share with all the listeners over the coming weeks.
Absolutely. We recorded a number of podcasts with our brand new Roadcaster unit, which we actually got to set up in a hunting lodge and do a bunch of wonderful literally around the table conversations with some wonderful professionals in Southeastern archaeology who gave us a number of wonderful insights. Also, a quick shout out to Dr. Shane Miller, who was generous enough to spend so much time talking with Jason and I I came away from that conversation, and Jason knows this. I said that's one of the smartest guys I've ever met right there. And again, truly just wonderful hosts. And so thanks to all of them. You'll be hearing more about that in episodes to come as we feature some of those interviews. And of course, you can always find our work and follow us online on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and of course at 7ages.org. Now, we've got something really special in store for tonight. Dr. David Carballo, who spent years working down at the Tlajinga site adjacent to Teotihuacan. And now, as I understand, he's been moved closer to the primary pyramid complex. But after all this discussion about southeastern archaeology, I think it's time to go a little further south as we continue this discussion on the other side of this break. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. There is perhaps no destination in Mesoamerica that quite rivals Teotihuacan. Located 30 miles northeast of Mexico City, Teotihuacan ranks as the most visited archaeological ruin site in the Western Hemisphere. And in the ancient world, as with today, Teotihuacan was a popular destination. It was a center for commerce and a hub for urban living. Now, David Carballo is a Boston University College of Arts and Science assistant professor of archaeology and author of Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central Mexico, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. Carballo has studied Teotihuacan for 2 decades, having carried out investigations of the Tlajinga district, as well as areas closer to the center of Teotihuacan. So, David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
The site itself, the founding of Teotihuacan, is a story of regional catastrophe. Migrants fleeing an incredibly powerful volcanic eruption, moving north, and eventually finding refuge in the valley that would become Teotihuacan. So to start off the conversation, what was the magnitude of this eruption and this catastrophe, and what would have been the local effects on the people that eventually settled at Teotihuacan?
Yeah, so the eruption sometime in the middle 1st century of our era, or AD, of the Popocatépetl volcano. That's a long term in Nahuatl, which was the Aztec language, that means smoking mountain. And sometime in the mid to late 1st century, it erupted at a scale that a volcanologist would call a VEI 6 eruption. And for comparison, a historical VEI 6 eruption was the Krakatoa volcano in Indonesia in the late 19th century, that when it erupted could be heard 2,000 miles away in Australia. So this would have been the magnitude of something that sounded like, a huge bomb going off. And certainly would have both been extremely disconcerting to the populations of the southern basin of Mexico and southern Puebla, and also had some ramifications for agriculture in the area, and had ashfall to the east that covered some archaeological sites and preserved them for archaeologists to study.
So essentially we're looking at people fleeing a catastrophe, moving north. And how did we begin to see the start of Teotihuacan? What was the initial plan that you can tell from the excavations?
Yeah, so there was occupation before this eruption, but it was much more rural. So there were just isolated villages in the area that date back to, about 1000 BC or so. The population was relatively low, and then there's a boom that starts even a little before this eruption. It starts taking off as a viable urban center, and one of the big enigmas of Teotihuacan is where this earliest occupation was concentrated. One of the problems is that there are springs, and the problem for archaeology, but not for the local population. There are springs to the southwest of the Teotihuacan Valley that would have been the most lush and desirable area to live in. But just because there's been deep alluvial or riverine deposits in this area, and the water table was relatively high in this area, it's been hard to conduct any archaeology there. And so there's been some salvage archaeology when new construction happens in that area but people will excavate and still be in colonial period or Aztec period levels when they hit water and basically have to close the thing up and build constructions over there. So my guess, and many of my colleagues would also guess, that some of the earliest occupation would be in this lush spring zone, but we're not seeing it just because of the modern environment. A little later, though, people start laying out what becomes the sacred precinct of the center of Teotihuacan, and that is associated with this volcanic eruption. And so there's the laying out of the first monuments, including what's called the pre-Ciudadela complex, where Sergio Gomez and Julie Gasola, two Mexican site archaeologists, have been working. That's to the south. And then the earlier incarnations of what then later become the sun and moon pyramids in their locations. And so the layout of that particular urban plan along something like a Street of the Dead or an axis like that is into the later first and then into the early second century.
That's fascinating. And, one of the interesting things, although I guess you might say that this occurs at almost any archaeological site, David, is that you'll see, separate layers that represent different periods of habitation. But with Teotihuacan, one, I guess, question that we have, and I know that this is kind of a buzzword, especially when it comes to popular archaeology, the idea of a so-called lost city. Now, in the case of Teotihuacan, it was apparently discovered when, again, migrants from this volcano, people who were fleeing this circumstance, they find the site. And so is that difficult, looking at what existed at the time of its rediscovery and then the subsequent occupation of the surrounding area over the ensuing centuries?
It's hard to say what exactly these migrants would have seen there. I mean, if it was just some scattered villages already becoming an urban center, when people mapped the area, archaeologists in the 1960s did mapping and surface collection in the area of pottery and can sort of date things relatively based on those associations. They estimated that even in the first century BC, before this volcanic eruption, there could have been 10 or 20,000 people living there. But we have no idea what any sort of public architecture of the time looked like in that early period.
Right.
But just based on ceramic remains, it does seem like there was some sort of sizable population, but then you have to remember the city grew to about 100,000 or more. So we're talking about a 5 to 10 time increase in the population that would have come associated after this volcanic eruption.
It was pretty massive indeed. What kind of information do we have about the structure, who may have built it, and what the origins of Teotihuacan may be?
I think we can look to a few signposts in the natural landscape. Like, it doesn't seem to be an accident at all that the two biggest pyramids, the Sun and the Moon Pyramid, in some ways shadow the largest mountains in the Teotihuacan Valley. So if you're standing on the Street of the Dead looking northward to the Moon Pyramid, you'll notice that Cerro Gordo, which is the largest hill in the valley, is shadowing it, is looming behind it. In a pretty awesome way. And as you get closer to the pyramid, it sort of grows in size in relation to this sacred mountain. Then when you stand on top of the Moon Pyramid and look at the Sun Pyramid, the second largest hill in the valley, Patlachique mountain range, which has sort of this stepped elements to it that almost look pyramidal, but on a much grander scale, are present there. Not only that, then you also get interesting possible alignments. Like, so for instance, from the Sun Pyramid, looking westward, there could have been the possible solar alignment of dividing the year into 260 and 105 day intervals, meaning you would see the sunset on that western horizon from the Sun Pyramid on intervals that would divide the year up that way. And that was highly significant for Mesoamerican people because they used both the solar calendar, which we know is 365 days plus a little, and also a ritual calendar of 260 days. And so having this alignment that split up the solar year into the ritual calendar plus its remainder seems to have been very significant. So they seem to have worked in both natural and astronomical phenomenon into the urban layout.
Something that you see at so many ancient sites.
And Dr. Carballo, I want to stay on Teotihuacan, obviously, but to make a connection to what you're discussing here, there's another site of a very large pyramid to the south, I believe, at Cholula. Is that considered to be the same group of people, and do the same type of alignments occur there?
Yeah, so Cholula is a fascinating site, and it's not that well known outside of Mexican archaeology. I joke with my students often; they probably know it as a hot sauce.
And a good one.
Yeah, but, it is a good hot sauce.
It in fact has the largest pre-Columbian pyramid construction anywhere in the Americas in terms of total volume, and I think it bigger volume overall than Khufu's pyramid in Egypt. But unlike that pyramid, or unlike the Sun Pyramid Teotihuacan, it was built incrementally in multiple phases. Sometimes starting this site is very close to the volcano, but it was outside of the ash fall from Popocatépetl, and so people moved eastward outside of the ash zone to Cholula. And there created what the later Choluteca of the Aztec period, who were, unfortunately massacred by Cortez and the Spaniards in one of the more poignant engagements of what's known as the Conquista. But they saw this earlier pyramid construction, which was then grass covered, as they called it, the man-made mountain, the Tlachihualtepetl. And so it was erected in multiple stages again during the first millennium. And it's a little hard to get at ethnicity for this period. So we do have later narratives that talk about a population called the Olmeca Xicalanga, and you might sense that term Olmec there, which has to do with people from around Veracruz and the rubber producing area of Mexico. And there could be some ties to the Gulf there, or perhaps Mixtec speaking populations is another possibility for these early occupants in Cholula. And Teotihuacan, we have the same problem, where we know from later Aztec narratives that there are said to have been historic period migrations from somewhere in the northwest, and deducing exactly when that was and how much it displaced existing populations is tricky to get at. But we're hoping that more studies, especially the growth of genetic analyses, which could get at migration patterns in these prehistoric periods, or ones that lack significant texts that at least can get at language. So we do know that Teotihuacanos had a writing system, but it's very difficult to understand phonetically what language would have been spoken, or if it was meant to be read in multiple languages. So if there was some earlier Aztec language, it would be in the Uto-Aztecan family, which is the largest in the Americas. It spans from Utah and Northern California through the American Southwest, all the way through Mesoamerican down to Nicaragua. But there's also the Otomagayan language family, which is older in central Mexico and includes Zapotec and Mixtec and Otomi, and it could have been a language that was the lingua franca of Teotihuacan, came from that family.
Very interesting. Now, speaking of the idea that there may have been a northwestern connection, I know that you've talked about in previous writings migrations from western Mexico. Are we talking about, that far northwest, or even further, considering the possible linguistic origins that go even further up into North America?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, where there's more clear ties. It's not, at least for this period, is not so far into the desert regions of these zones, say between Mesoamerican and the American Southwest. There we have better evidence really after Teotihuacan, starting with say Toltec system, and we have, for instance, turquoise trade that's coming from northwest Mexico. There's hardly any turquoise in Teotihuacan at all. There might be a couple pieces from the newly excavated tunnel under the Ciudadela, but otherwise we don't see those ties. And we also, so for instance, in the Pueblo iconography and even animal remains, where we start seeing Mesoamerican birds like macaws, that's a little later. It would be post-Teotihuacan. But nevertheless, we do know that maize made it up there. I mean, so people were walking, people were migrating and connecting those two areas, going back into deep history. But when we look at sort of connections with West Mexico in Teotihuacan times, or immediately before it, we look at areas like the Bajío region of Guanajuato today, which is a very productive, lush agricultural zone of Mexico. There's some similarities in ceramic and figurine styles. There's also the precursor to Teotihuacan is the big city in the basin of Mexico, Cuicuilco, has these interesting circular pyramids that people don't exactly know what to make of, because later pyramids are all rectangular or square. But in West Mexico, they do have some circular pyramids too. So that might show a link there.
Yeah, that's a fascinating architectural side note in itself. And we should maybe come back to that. I do want to touch on trade really quickly, because you talk about the fact that turquoise found at Teotihuacan, again, not something indigenous to the region, something also that you find a lot. And when you mention up there, we're talking about 7,000 feet in altitude. I mean, it's in the highlands, Teotihuacan, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's a high plains environment. That's, in the U.S., we talk about Denver as the mile-high city, but Mexico City is the mile-and-a-half-high city. So, it's considerably higher.
It's on up there. Now, you find an abundance of shells, and this was especially the case in excavations you carried out at Tlajinga. And you note the number of shells that occur in this area. They, of course, had to have been brought to that area from the coastal regions, which also tells us a fair amount about the kinds of trade that was occurring between different people in this region, and over, at times, very great distances.
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things about Teotihuacan is how it seems to have been a magnet for not just those initial populations fleeing a volcanic eruption, but then continuing for centuries in the up to the mid first millennium, of people who were traders, people who were making pilgrimages to the city. And here I especially would want to note the work of my colleague Linda Manzanilla, who is a Mexican archaeologist who's worked in different parts of the site. And she, in particular, where she worked in Teopan Casco, which is a residential cluster to the southeast of the city, she's found really strong contacts with the Gulf of Mexico region, and that people, they have fish species from the Gulf of Mexico, which would have had to have been smoked or dried in some way to make that journey up into the mountains. There's a lot of shell. There's also evidence of cotton production, and cotton needs to grow in a warmer, more low environment than the Altiplano around Teotihuacan. So that was coming in also from a distance. And where I work, as you mentioned, in Tlajinga, which is a simpler, lower status residential cluster in the south of the city, they also had access to shell from both the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico. They're smaller. They're nothing like what you find in the pyramids, where you have these massive sea snails and that are carved and very elaborate. But it shows that even people who are the lowest quartile or third of the city's socioeconomic spectrum had access to these long distance resources.
The movement of the resources is always something that I find fascinating, because it shows that there's an infrastructure in play between all of these different groups and different peoples, and that things are moving in different directions. And that leads me to the question of the fact that there appears to be no fortifications around the city. So what are we to make of that? Does that have anything to do with the trade and the migrations, or is that just indicative of there not being a whole lot of warfare in the region at the time?
Yeah, it's another one of the fascinating issues with Teotihuacan, and a lot of Mesoamerican centers in general. For many time periods, fortifications don't seem important. Then there are other time periods where they are made. In particular, when Teotihuacan collapsed as a big city and state, those upstart city-states of, say, between about 600 to 900 AD that tried to fill the void, they do create some citadel or fortified cities. And it suggests that there's a political vacuum and a contested political landscape that resulted in warring city-states in that period. But early in Teotihuacan, as you say, there's no walls on the defensive walls out on the periphery. I think this also gets at significant differences in how Mesoamerican war was practiced compared to other ancient societies. So even though we're dealing with large-scale urban populations with maybe over 100,000 people at Teotihuacan, there was no cavalry, there are no horses, there's no big naval battles, for instance, as you see in many parts of the old world. There's no use of metals in this utilitarian way. So people, even though they had very sophisticated military formations and ways of training warriors. They are fighting literally with sticks and stones. So it is, wood and obsidian technologies. And there's no possibility of, say, then laying siege to a city or those sorts of ramping up in offensive and defensive capabilities like we saw in the sequence of Eurasian warfare throughout, say, the Mediterranean and into East Asia. So warfare was very different in Mesoamerica. And we do know from, say, the Aztec period that capturing prisoners to be sacrificed back at the temple was the only way that somebody rose in military rank. So if you killed somebody on the battlefield, that did nothing for you as your rank as a warrior. But if you captured them to be sacrificed to the gods back in the temples of the city, then you rose in military rank. So all of the incentives were skewed towards that sort of practice, and it framed warfare within that religious context. And we can assume that it was also true in Teotihuacan for the lack of fortifications, for the fact that we do see sacrifices of people indexed as warriors within the major temple constructions.
Yeah, in addition to those aspects of, again, a kind of a warfare society, as evidenced in the architecture that are lacking, something else that we don't see a whole lot of at Teotihuacan is art that emphasizes individual rulers and leaders. And you've mentioned in the past that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there are royal tombs that have been discovered there. So this lack of emphasis on rulers and characters, individuals, unlike what you would see in ancient Egypt or other areas, that seems to also speak something of the structure of society and the political ideology there at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of the fascinating issues for me is what was the political organization of the city and the state that it controlled. And there is a difference of opinion among specialists of Teotihuacan. So for instance, my colleague Saburo Sugiyama thinks that perhaps there was a royal tomb both inside the Sun Pyramid that has been looted, and then also that the recently excavated tunnel under the Ciudadela might have had some royal connotations, or that a tomb could have been taken out of there. But even if that's the case, rulers of Teotihuacan couldn't express their individuality in a way that was done, say, in the Maya lowlands in the same period of time, or the Olmec culture of the Gulf of Mexico before Teotihuacan. So rulership seems to have been more faceless and framed in terms of religious principles, in terms of keeping cosmic harmony going and the city thriving. And so people have offered a few different options of rulership, which need not have been static for 600 years of occupation. So, remember, if we think of Roman society that went from, a republic to an empire to having joint rule of co-rulers later in its history, any sort of complex society can go through these sorts of changes. And so Teotihuacan might have as well. But it does seem to have had a more collective rule. Maybe it was a theocracy for much of its history. Maybe it had some powerful senate that had, co-rulers. We do know such instances from later Mesoamerica, cases of 2 rulers or 4 rulers. And so those are all possibilities that I think we need to query a little more closely in regards to the data from the city.
Yeah. Is it possible, knowing that, again, this was kind of a hub for people who are coming from different areas? I mean, the architecture in some ways may indicate that. Evidence of the kinds of trade throughout the region definitely shows that. In other words, it was a popular destination, sort of a melting pot culturally. Does that suggest something about the political structure of Teotihuacan as well?
I would say so, yes. I think the fact that the city needed to integrate tens of thousands of people with this migration event associated with the volcanic eruption. And then when we look at attributes of the city, first, the lack of individuality in much of the art, but also that this, to my knowledge, is the only pre-industrial city of this sort of size, of 100,000 or more people, that isn't like a special function city, like, say a garrison town or a workers' village like we know from Egypt or the Romans. It's the only city of this scale where almost the entire population lived in multifamily apartments. And that's very rare for the pre-industrial world and maybe unique. It's always, you're always wary of using that term unique.
Sure.
But for Teotihuacan, it seems like it's the only one or of a small handful that made this multifamily apartment living the dominant housing type. And the fact that people were living in these sort of large groups of commingling families probably tells us something important about its social organization and the lack of individualism in the city and the need to integrate these diverse populations, not just at the outset, but then later through trade, through migration, through religious pilgrimage that seems to have continually occurred in the city up until its demise.
Again, a lot of your work was in the Tlajinga area, and in addition to the art that we see representative of a more, I might call it a cosmological kind of an outlook on things rather than a kind of militaristic or a individual kind of or a character-centric idea politically. There's art that was found in the excavations of the apartment complexes at Tlajinga as well. What does that art seem to indicate?
Tlajinga, it's really lower status housing, and so lots of the construction was a mix of some of it is cut stone, some of it is uncut stone, some is adobe. The plaster seems to be sort of mud-based, very little lime plaster that was painted. There was probably some lime plaster in the courtyards, but not on the walls. But in other places, like in the center of the city where there are murals, again, the themes, when there are individuals, sometimes there are humans depicted, they don't seem to be singled out for their identity as a particular person. Rather, it's their social role that is important. So it could be a number of priests wearing a headdress and having offering or incense bags that they're making ritual offerings from. It could be scenes of animals that seem to be representing supernatural entities or powers, and used in that way. They're framed generally, in other words. We don't have murals from everywhere, but where they've been preserved suggests to us that this was very much a painted city, that mural traditions were like one of the most important or valued art style within Teotihuacan, to the point where even people out in more peripheral zones had fresco paintings within their apartment compounds that linked them to the religious and cosmovision of the city.
Yeah. Now, I'm interested, of course, in some of the art that is found in that area. And although murals may not be one of the depictions in the Tlajinga area, again, being the more common kind of dwelling spaces, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there was a particular stone mask that you described that was found among what appeared to be a termination ritual that actually was found in one of the apartment complexes, right?
Yes, right.
You've called this in other interviews and articles that you've done one of your favorite pieces that's been discovered. Can we talk about that mask, what it represents, but also in the context of a termination ritual and what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So we use the term termination ritual and consecration ritual as the sorts of ritual practices that Mesoamericans engaged in, and in some cases still descendant communities engage in today, where, for instance, structures are viewed as animate entities or entities that have souls. They need to be consecrated and made sacred at the beginning of the construction, and oftentimes offerings are left in little cysts within the floors or altars of buildings. And then when their use is done, then they can be terminated, which a classic termination practice in Mesoamerica is to smash things, is to ritually destroy things, especially pottery. And so the Aztecs, for instance, when they did their new fire ceremony, which was the great calendrical rite of passage, everybody would smash the pots that they had in their households and get new ones. And it was like a turning over of life every 52 years. And they would light a sacred fire, would be part of it. People would extinguish their fires. And so we see evidence of this in earlier periods as well, including in Teotihuacan. And in the Tlajinga compound, even though these were, again, non-elites living out on the periphery of the city, we found in one of the courtyards the evidence of a termination ritual where a bunch of vessels were smashed, the maize grinding stones and other tools were thrown into the courtyard, and they also left face down this nicely sculpted face. And they're often called masks, though they probably would have been too heavy for anyone to wear. And so they could have adorned an effigy body, like we know from later periods in Mesoamerica. Perhaps it represented some sort of generic ancestor to the lineage that lived in this particular apartment compound. And just from the socioeconomic perspective, it's fascinating that people who were, again, at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum had access to nice things like this stone face or mask. Another nice piece that we recovered is a stuccoed and painted pot. And so thinking about those mural traditions, they were, lime stucco and then painted in vibrant pigments. People in Tlajinga didn't have mural arts in their own, on their own walls that we can tell. Maybe some public buildings in the district might have had those, but not in their homes. But they did have these pots that were treated in a very similar manner. So the technology was the same, of putting this lime stucco around the outside of the pot and then using natural pigments to paint motifs that in the case of the example we found were different types of nose adornments associated with water deities, the storm god and the terrestrial water goddess. So again, these religious principles associated with fertility and abundance, possibly a link to ancestors of the particular compound. Those were the sorts of local religious themes that were important to people living out on the periphery of Teotihuacan.
Right. Yeah, I may want to come back to religion here in a moment, but as we're discussing art, and maybe this is the influence of our fall field trip, Jason, my colleague, and I, and our geologist, James Waldo, we visited a number of wonderful Mississippian mound sites throughout the Southeast. And again, the pottery on display, I mean, the cultural heritage that is evidenced through the art is just fascinating. And many would say that in the lithic industries that there's an artful aspect to it also. Now, I believe at compound 17S3E1, there was a remarkable amount of obsidian production occurring right there, which is sort of a hallmark of the Teotihuacan lithic industry. So can we talk about the obsidian working that is found at the site?
Oh, yeah, I'd be happy to. So not only did we excavate there in Tlajinga, but what I did, my dissertation work was at the Moon Pyramid, where there was also an obsidian workshop. But it's very interesting, the contrast between the two. So at Tlajinga, we have out on the periphery utilitarian obsidian production. And so people in particular made prismatic blades, the razor blade and general cutting implement of classic Mesoamerica. And they produce them in large quantities. We think we also have evidence of apprenticeship having occurred within the apartment compound. So we can see different skill levels. We can see a very high-end master craftsperson who was making and maintaining these prismatic blade cores, which are quite beautiful. And those of you who have experimented a little with making stone tools can value them for the very fine platforms and regular removals of blades. And then we also see a lower end of people who probably were just getting started at BU. Some students do flint knapping, and we get a sense of what a novice level looks like, and what intermediate. I'm probably, even though I've been at it for 20 years, I do it so infrequently. I'm just sort of an intermediate level napper, and so I can appreciate the levels that are both lower and much higher than my own abilities. And so we think these people out on the periphery of the site, utilitarian production was their niche into this bigger economy by making, in the case of that compound, obsidian tools. In the case of the compound to the west of there, but it's still in Tlajinga, they were potters and just making basic utilitarian food production and storage vessels. And that's quite different than the production that we see centered on temple complexes. So next to the Moon Pyramid, we found evidence of mass production of weapons made of obsidian and ritual items, what people call eccentrics, things that are zoomorphic or anthropomorphic images, very large knives that don't seem functional. They seem just more for offerings within the major pyramids of the site. And the model that I believe works best for explaining this pattern is one that draws on what we know that the Mexica Aztecs did, where they would have a labor tax on artisans who could produce, for the market in their homes, but then were called into palaces and temples at certain times of the year to produce for the state. The Nahuatl term for this is koa tekit. Tekit is sort of your labor obligation, and koat gives this idea of reciprocity, so that the state gives to you and you give back to the state in terms of your labor. And I think that makes sense for Teotihuacan, where we see very intensive production in households in these apartment compounds, but then associated with a few temple and palace complexes, either higher level sort of ritual production or military production, things where the end products would be directed towards the system of governance.
Wow, the fascinating, that's incredibly fascinating. As a flint knapper myself, I can truly appreciate the skill that it takes, especially working with obsidian, which is so fragile and soft. But, it leads me to think about, many of the things you just described and that you mentioned. Is it safe to say that this valuable green obsidian that was being utilized at Teotihuacan, would that sort of represent the center of their economic power and influence in the region? I know each area kind of has their own thing that they're known for, but would that be the primary source of economic stimulation for this group of people?
It certainly would have been one of the main ones. So Teotihuacan is near a number of obsidian sources, and as you mentioned, the Pachuca green one was particularly valued, both for being very homogeneous in its texture, its very predictive fracture patterns, but also having this green and sometimes gold hue to it, which was just aesthetically valued by Mesoamericans and moved great distances. So it was found, as far away as Honduras and other parts of Central America. And even one Pachuca scraper has been found in Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, though that seems to be post-Teotihuacan, like a Toltec period, that made its way up there and probably was down the line trade, not like direct trade. But in any case, people really valued it aesthetically and also for its utilitarian purposes. The fact that when people migrated northward, why settle in Teotihuacan? It probably had a few things going for it. It received less rainfall than to the south that had just been devastated by that volcanic eruption, but it did have natural springs in the Teotihuacan Valley, which made that area a little more productive than other parts of the northern basin of Mexico. It also was situated close to 4 different obsidian sources, including the Pachuca or Sierra de las Navajas source. And it also was located in an exit or entrance to the Basin of Mexico, which would have allowed for the sorts of expansion or trade eastward that we were talking about earlier, like to the Gulf of Mexico. So it had a few things in terms of its ecology going for it. I think in terms of products, obsidian is a highland product that could have been used in trade with the lowlands, also other volcanic stone like basalt that you make maize grinding tools out of could have been another product. Products of agaves or other succulents could have also been a trade product from the highlands. But that would have been getting all the things from the lowlands that Teotihuacanos really valued, like jaguar pelts and tropical bird feathers and cacao and cotton and shell, what they would have been getting in exchange. So I think another thing the Teotihuacanos exported was a worldview. They exported a compelling way of framing the cosmos and human involvement in it to keep it going. So at the same time there was this sort of commercial exchange. I think there was this ideological exchange that was important.
Yeah, certainly all of those factors, are to be attributed to a society as large and influential as Teotihuacan was, but I think it's always important when we're discussing these sort of larger than life sites, if you will, to get down to the human level and talk about the daily life. And I know that you really focus a lot of your research and writing on the residential quarters, the living areas of the people. And so I want to discuss those living quarters because I know that they seem to be very advanced for the time. They have a lot of the amenities that we would expect of a modern home. And what kind of insight can you give us to their daily lives, their health, their food, and just the layout of the residences themselves?
Yeah, so the Teotihuacan apartment compound is something that is innovated in Teotihuacan. There was no direct precursor to it earlier in Mesoamerica, though it does draw from architectural canons that existed in earlier periods. So, for instance, at the heart of every household unit within the apartment compound, and in some cases within the central sort of public space of the apartment compound itself, was a courtyard or patio group that had buildings that were elevated and usually in the talud tablero architecture, which is one sloped talus wall and then one straight tablero wall, that could be a mix of the sort of temple complexes and elite residences, or within the family, I should say, the highest ranking lineage members or elders could have lived in those more central structures. And then other architecture that is orthogonal, meaning sort of grid-like cellular architecture that expands outward from there and fills the walls of the compound, which were bounded, so they had external walls to them. We see some differences between the apartment compounds of the center of the city, which, as you can imagine, was the first to urbanize, and so it got dense there, and people were more hedged in by their neighbors, and so they have very sort of square, rectangular apartment compounds in those areas. Whereas out in Tlajinga, where urbanization happened a little later as the city sprawled to the south, we see more irregular patterns. They're still on this orthogonal plan, but they have sort of room blocks that are jutting out in one area where there was more space. So it suggests maybe there the families, as they added on to their family, could create new room blocks and give it that sort of irregular shape to it. But really at the heart is this mix of this cellular architecture and having these central spaces. So they don't have windows, and you would get your light from the roof indirectly. So within a courtyard, it was not roofed in, so natural light would come in from above. And around those courtyards, you typically first have a portico, or a building that has a couple pillars and a roof on it, but it is open on one side, or could have only had curtains. So that would allow you to have some nice shade, but also get light. And then in the rooms in back would be darker, and you'd need some sort of lamp or some sort of fire that would provide light in those areas. Another really interesting thing we found in Tlajinga, so in one area, compound 18, we were able to dig deeper than normal. So one of the problems, of course, in archaeology here is that later layers, to be able to get to the early ones, you often need to dismantle later architecture. And so that can be problematic, especially if it's more substantial architecture. But in this area of Tlajinga, we just sort of had earthen floors and adobe walls, and so we could dismantle some of them to dig down deep to the substrate of tuft, or basically the bedrock for this area, where it's sterile soil. And so we got over 2.5 meters of stratigraphic sequence, and we could see down below the early pre-apartment compound living, where people were living in these pole and thatch or wattle daub houses, and then the transition to these apartment compounds. And something that changed with that urbanization to this apartment living was that earlier on people had their own fire pits, their own hearths in their houses or right next to their houses. And as people lived in denser concentrations, probably you couldn't make a fire that would get smoke in everybody's apartment. So people likely were cooking outside. We don't see hearths anymore, but we do start seeing these ceramic stoves, where people probably reheated the food that they had cooked previously outside for longer periods of time. And it was one way of adapting in terms of a ceramic tradition to urban life.
In addition to the fact that they were moving the fire outside, does that possibly indicate also a broader sense of community, in the sense that maybe these outdoor fires were actually being used by several groups of people at a time?
That certainly could be. It's a little hard to see. We haven't excavated enough of them. There are some in one part of Tlajinga where I mentioned there were potters, but in that case, they're at least firing pots, or what we can see from the surface. So we do need more excavations in public spaces, or the spaces between apartment compounds, to get at those issues. And so far, those are a little lacking. But yeah, that's a good idea. It seems like there'd be some more communal cooking activities outside, at least shared within an apartment compound that, again, has dozens of people living in it. So people would be cooperating at that level.
Right. And briefly about the pottery, I just wanted to ask, is that what's known as the San Martin orange pottery that's found in that area?
Yes. Yeah. Great. You've done your research. So San Martin orange is a utilitarian ware, but it seems slightly higher fire than your typical Teotihuacan ware, and it's later in the city's history. It's maybe about 400 to 550 or so, and they make these forms that look like amphora, like that you could find almost in the Mediterranean, and basins. They're not decorated, but this more high-fired orange clay.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I always find the human level, the basic living conditions and all of those things to be of utmost interest to me, because it really gives insight to the daily lives of the people, which I think are often overlooked. But another important factor that we have to discuss here is the social and the religious aspects of Teotihuacan. And I know that we have three primary structures within the site: the Pyramid of the Sun, the Moon, and the Feathered Serpent. So if you could just give us some insight into how the religion was based, what it was based upon, and what can you tell from the archaeology about how it was distributed amongst the people there at the site?
Yeah, so those three do seem to be, in terms of symbolism, obviously preeminent. The three largest monuments or complexes. And there does seem to be, in terms of the sculpture that's been found around them, the offering complexes found within them, division that could have some connections to the celestial divisions that the Aztecs gave us. So the Aztecs called them the Sun and the Moon Pyramid. They likely were not direct depictions of principles of the sun and the moon, but the Sun Pyramid does seem to have a lot of imagery associated with fire. So it seems to have these big braziers discovered around it that are very consistent in their symbolism to the braziers that the Aztecs used for the new fire ceremony. Only a few years ago, up on the top of the pyramid, the Mexican archaeologist Nelly Zoe Ruion excavated a sculpture of the fire god, this aged god who's hunched over and has a brazier on his head. There's also jaguar imagery. There is this sort of skull sun-looking sculpture that came from that area. So it seems to be associated with more fire and potentially solar imagery. Then the Moon Pyramid is associated with, two statues of goddesses, and we know that they have some similarities in form to the Aztec goddess of terrestrial waters, which was called Chalchiatlique, and she was sort of the counterpart to Tlaloc, who is the water from the sky, or the storm god. And also the hill that's behind it, Cerro Gordo, is associated with springs and with water. And down in the Moon Plaza, the archaeologist Veronica Ortega excavated these very aquatic-themed deposits with shell and greenstone stela. So a lot of it seems to be, more gendered female and water associated, where the sun could be fire and potentially more gendered male. And then down to the south in the Feathered Serpent complex, we have a smaller pyramid, but one where a huge amount of labor went into the sculpture decorating it. And there, the Feathered Serpent, we know from Aztec times, is associated with Quetzalcoatl, or is called Quetzalcoatl, and is associated with Venus, the planet Venus. And if we apply what Sugiyama, I think, argues very cogently, a standard unit of measurement for Teotihuacan, the complex, the Ciudadela complex, would be encoding 584, which is the Venus cycle. So that's where Venus, so Mesoamericans understood that Venus was a single celestial body. It didn't think, like many other cultures believed, there was a morning star and an evening star. But Mesoamericans understood there was, it was a single entity, and that it could be visible, say, at sunrise for part of the year, then it goes away, and then it comes back at sunset or in the evening sky, and then goes away again and comes back as morning star. And that cycle is 584 days. And it seems to be encoded into the Ciudadela complex. So you would then get some association with fire and water and potentially sun and the moon by extension. And then Venus is the third most important celestial body in the sky, especially for Mesoamericans. On
that discussion, David, of Quetzalcoatl and the idea of that imagery, and I want to be very careful in broaching this direction, but nonetheless, I think it warrants consideration, and I definitely want an expert opinion on this, as featured, by the way, in the recent PBS series Native America, which was just incredible. And of course, you contributed to some of that as well. The imagery that we see at locations like Teotihuacan does at times appear to be similar to, for instance, some of the southeastern and just throughout the South United States in general, modern United States, North America, some of the Native American sites that we find there, especially among the Mississippian culture. We visited a lot of those sites, and one of the things that you often see is this motif of a feathered serpent. Now, is that just sort of a universal kind of an archetype, or is there, in your opinion, any evidence that there is a direct connection between that kind of imagery found in the southern North American continent and then what we see in Mesoamerica as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm certainly speculating here, but
sure.
If I have license to do that, I think I'm compelled by certain deeply shared Amerind principles. So that don't necessarily tell us about culture contacts of only 1,000 years ago, but tell us about some sort of shared ancestry and shared important concepts of how the world is divided and how major principles of the cosmos function. And so, I think that the sky serpent imagery throughout the Americas might have deep links going back to early Amerind populations, or even people of the Paleolithic in Northeast Asia who crossed over the Bering Straits. Some of the other similarities, are seeing, for instance, a rabbit in the moon, or having 4 directions in a world center with color connotations to those world directions, having shamanistic-like religions. So, shaman is a Siberian term for a religious leader who has the ability to transform into animal spirits or to access animal spirits, and that's sort of seen widely throughout Amerind populations. So, I think it might be associated with a deep shared understanding of how the world works. Alternatively, the other possibility, well, I guess there's 2 other possibilities. One would be that it sort of diffused from some area in later periods. And so, for instance, if it came from Mesoamerica to the southwest or southeast with horned serpents and antler-wearing serpents, or that it's just independent invention, that there's, the people are fascinated by natural properties of serpents. They seem to, almost fly, or they move around without legs. It's sort of a weird animal, and they also they go down into the bowels of the earth, or they disappear and they come up into the terrestrial plane, and so they can sort of connect the underworld to the terrestrial world. So these are all possibilities, but for the time being, I sort of favor the idea of a deeply shared idea or conception of sky serpents.
Yeah, and that's understandable, because one of the things that interests me about all of this is, again, to put it sort of poetically, the idea of an archaeology of the mind. I mean, that there is an element of the human mind that shows, you might liken it to stratigraphy, just like archaeologists who remove layers of earth to find out about the past. I mean, evolutionary stages that humans have gone through seem to bear the same quality, if you prescribe to psychological concepts like archetypes and things like this, which is at least one way of interpreting the apparent continuity that appears to exist symbologically and otherwise between these cultures. But now, on the other side of that, one thing I would love to kind of posit here, and again, I think that it should fairly be stated this is somewhat speculative, but you mentioned obsidian found at Spiro Mound, which appeared to have also come from that region. At times, could it be that there is, and even if that isn't something that's carried over cosmologically in terms of origin, in terms of, their conceptual development or anything else, at very least, might we say that there is evidence of trade that was certainly occurring between different regions, North America, Mesoamerica, and perhaps other places during that time?
Yes, I think so for sure. And so we do know in some 16th century accounts, like Cabeza de Vaca was a person who got marooned. One of the fascinating sort of early conquistador accounts was marooned around Tampa Bay and walked with someone who was born an African slave named Estevancillo, basically crossed the entire southern United States in a decade or so, interacting with lots of native peoples. And we have his account, and he talks about trade intercourse between people from the south, from Mesoamerica, and people in the Puebloan region where he ended up. So we do have an eyewitness account from the 16th century, but then we have a lot of archaeological evidence as well. And so some people to the southeast, say the Mississippian sphere, have posited relationships between the Huastec region, which is in northeast Mexico. The Huastecs are actually a Mayan group. They're linguistically Mayan, but they became isolated from the main branch on the Yucatan Peninsula. And especially around the time of the fall of Teotihuacan and into about, say, 1000 AD or so, and up to the Aztec conquest of the area, make beautiful sculpture and have their own sort of distinctive art style. And so there are some similarities with things that you see in Mississippian period art. For instance, shell gorgets that are depicting parrots or macaw birds that could have come from that region. And so, certainly there could have been trade contacts there.
That's fascinating. We would be remiss if we didn't discuss the tunnel that was recently unearthed beneath one of the primary complexes, apparently of ceremonial significance. But again, I'll err to the judgment of the expert. Why don't you tell us a bit about it?
Sure. So this tunnel was fascinating and has been painstakingly excavated by Sergio Gomez Chavez and his team, and over really about a decade. And so I mentioned earlier there's a volcanic tuff substrate in central Mexico. We use the Nahuatl term tepetate, which means sleeping mat of stone, that the Aztecs called it. It can be quite hard, especially once it gets sun-dried. And so occasionally we dig into it, archaeologically. It's usually sterile, but sometimes, for instance, to excavate underneath the moon pyramid, you don't want to dismantle the wall, and so you dig a tunnel that goes down underneath it and comes up. And so that means with iron or steel tools, we're excavating this material and seeing how hard it is. So the fact that people who didn't have metals could excavate it is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And not only did they excavate it, they cut a shaft that goes down 15 meters from around the center of the plaza in the Ciudadela, and then extends for over 100 meters underground to the heart of the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, or I should say, 15 meters below the heart of the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, and then opens up to this multi-lobed chamber. And throughout it were just offerings through the tunnel and then in this central area, which often has been maintained relatively moist by the groundwater there. And so that has allowed for very good organic preservation, or much better than is typical for Teotihuacan. So there's a lot of wood artifacts, and there's even been some remnants of potential human skin and other little pieces of textile that we normally don't get preserved in Teotihuacan. And so, the amazing thing is all this effort was made into constructing what seems to have been a ceremonial underworld, or a passage into the underworld. And, analyses are still in process, but at the center of it were 3 different greenstone female statuettes and 1 male statuette. And they each had backpacks on them, or what looked to be, packs on their backs, that had pyrite discs and jade ear spools and other objects. And one possibility that Sergio proposes is that these 4 founding figures represent ancestral founding fathers and mothers. 3 of the 4 are actually women, of Teotihuacan, and that it's related to a myth of origins of the city that were then encoded in offerings in this ceremonial underworld.
So would it be accurate to refer to those as, I guess you wouldn't call them effigies per se, but I mean they are representative of ancestral belief systems where the founding fathers of Teotihuacan are represented in the actual art, fitted with backpacks, sent off into the underworld or to the afterlife in general, on this cosmological kind of a journey into the ever after. I mean, that seems to be what this represents in this tunnel.
That could be, yeah. And there is a precedent for sort of founding figures wearing packs with sacred bundles in them. So when we look at the Aztec migration stories, the people leaving the Aztlan and Chicomostoc, which is the place of seven caves, they're carrying these packs. Like, for instance, the Mexica are carrying the pack with Huitzilopochtli, their patron god, on the back. So it's not totally just taken out of thin air. It has a 16th century precedent that could have applied to Teotihuacan.
Wow.
And Dr. Carballo, as we begin to sort of wrap up the conversation here, ultimately, by the time the Mexica or the Aztecs had found Teotihuacan, it had been abandoned for centuries. So ultimately, what do we attribute the abandonment of such a important center of life? What was it that caused the people to eventually leave, and how long was it from the time of abandonment to the time that it was rediscovered by the Mexica?
Yeah, so one thing I should point out from the get-go is people never totally left the Teotihuacan Valley. And so sometimes in documentaries, including those I've participated in, it's portrayed a little bit like the Aztecs are discovering this sacred city now reclaimed by vegetation. When we know, so in Tlajinga, I have Toltec burials, I have Aztec pottery, I have early colonial period remains, and in fact, it's estimated that the population of the entire Teotihuacan Valley was higher in Aztec times than it was in classic period times when the city was at its height. It was more distributed. There were multiple smaller centers around the valley, but there were always people living there. It was part of the domain of Texcoco with the Acolwa ethnic group, who were sort of the second most influential Aztec group of the Triple Alliance, so we know it's the Aztec Empire. So people always connected with it. It did fall into depopulation at around 550 to 600 AD, and that was associated with a real cataclysmic burning of the city center around the Street of the Dead, so including the temple complexes and palatial complexes. It does not include burning out on the periphery. So when we excavate at Tlajinga, we don't see that apartment compounds were destroyed. If you imagine some sort of marauding army coming through into the city, you might expect that. So instead, it seems to have been very targeted and purposeful deconsecration of the buildings of religious and political significance. And so for these reasons, I think some sort of model of an internal conflict and internal termination of the city, of at least its sacred precinct, is most consistent with the data that we have at hand. And what exactly precipitated this is hard to say. We see some patterns, for instance, that potentially out on the outside of the center, that intermediate elites, the people who sort of oversaw district centers and the production associated with them, might have somehow tried to co-opt power away from the centralized state structure. In other apartment compounds, we see what this actually Sergio Gomez again has called like a phenomenon of a gated community, where so at the La Ventilla compound, it seems like there was more restrictive access to the apartment compounds, and possibly a some sort of checkpoints like we would expect with gated communities, suggested with some sort of internal strife that was causing people to wall themselves off from other adjacent communities within the city. And why exactly this happened? People, there are some climatic models that suggest some sort of drought period. That could have been the case. Oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot of the climate science is done without consulting closely with archaeologists. And so they have like, oh, there's a big drought at 650 AD, and so that's the fall of Teotihuacan, and they're using some outdated textbook, where we now know the burning is solidly around 550 to 600. So if there's any drought at 650, that's too late for causing that sort of termination. And so I'm wary of those until they sort of collaborate more closely with the archaeological sequence. Potentially, there's also the closing off of the trade corridors. And there's some evidence where I worked in northern Tlaxcala, which was a trade corridor eastward to the Gulf of Mexico, that the area becomes more contested. People start fortifying their settlements, and that could have been part of closing off the exchange relations that made Teotihuacan such a central place.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and informative conversation. And just to kind of put a final thought on it, I understand that there have been some modern threats to the site, one of which was the building of a Walmart supercenter within 1 mile of the complex, which I know brought a lot of protests and a lot of activism against it. And so my final question for you, Dr. Carballo, is there anything other than that is currently a threat to the site itself, and do we see more encroachment of modern society around the site?
Yeah, so just in terms of the modern urban landscape here, Mexico City, of course, is one of the biggest cities of the world, and we just want to take a responsible mediating role of matching their interests with the possibility of also retaining some information from the site and continuing to study it out on the periphery, while natural processes of modern urbanization continue. And so we think, we've tried a few different initiatives of working with communities, of course, giving talks within communities and at schools, and especially getting kids invested in the archaeology at the site, because that's going to be the next generation. It's the ones that grow up around the site and that could value archaeology, not just as a tourist draw, but as a way of understanding deep human history.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I mean, this has been so incredibly informative, and truly you are the person to talk to when it comes to this subject. We hope to be able to speak again in the future, and best of luck with your continuing endeavors, okay?
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure, and I really appreciate how much work you did beforehand, because it was very clear that you've read up on the city and the research there, and so that's always so comforting.
Well, again, we take this very seriously, and we appreciate your work and dedication so very much. David Carballo, again, he is the author of a number of papers and also the book entitled Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central Mexico, published in 2015 by Oxford University Press. And boy, what a wonderful person to talk with, Jason. I have to say, there was one moment, of course, that really stood out to me. Would you like to hazard to guess what that might have been?
I will say the presence of obsidian at the Spiro Mound.
That was absolutely correct, yeah. And you and I, our eyebrows shot up when he mentioned that aspect, because, again, I find that interesting in the context of the kinds of trade and the engagement that different cultures in different regions at that time were having. And as we have noted, and of course this was kind of featured in a rather compelling segment on the PBS series aforementioned during the interview there, which is called Native America, I mean, there's the indisputable presence of coca found at various sites throughout the Southwest, which clearly shows that this was an item that was traded and that was brought that far north. It's not out of the realm of the possible that there were other kinds of trade occurring, and that there were, again, as we find archaeological evidence of, obsidian from this region at Spiro Mound, which definitely suggests a possible. We've got to be careful. And even as Dr. Carballo said, he was speculating, but I mean, that seems that there's a possible connection. And I do wonder about some of the symbolism that we see that appears to bear continuity between, for instance, the Mississippian culture and sites like Teotihuacan.
Well, absolutely. And this is something that in private we've all discussed many times with different archaeologists and anthropologists and amongst ourselves here at Seven Ages is a detailed study of Mississippian sites truly does lend a general familiarization with this world of cosmological symbols. And, it's hard to deny the fact that many of those symbols and even interpretations of gods, feathered serpents, and things of this nature are very, very similar to those that we see throughout Mesoamerica. And going back again to what we just discussed with the migration routes and the trade routes, again, it is not unusual to see vast amounts of distance that's covered on these trade routes. I mean, again, we at the Hopewell sites in Ohio, we see the presence of material from Yellowstone. Again, we see shells and things of that at Spiral Mound. We see it at Etowah. We see it at Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is also home to some jade artifacts that come from Guatemala, if I remember correctly from my research. So we're seeing these vast trade over long distances, and it basically was an economic system, just as we discussed during the interview, and different places had different things to offer, and they would focus their economics and their trade and their craft and their arts around local materials.
Yeah, and Dr. Bradley Lepper has even commented in some of his articles about distinct similarities that appear especially between southeastern Mississippian sites and certain Mayan sites. And he says, again, that's speculative, but we could certainly say that there is the possibility that these cultures were interacting. But again, here's my contention. There is known interaction that was occurring over portions of North America that spanned a much greater distance than the distance would have been to some of those southeastern Mississippian sites to parts of Mesoamerica. The point I want to make here is that I think at times we as humans place imaginary boundaries on things, like, for instance, the idea of a border between the U.S. and Mexico. And I'm not being political here. I'm literally saying that, we define that as a border between two regions that we recognize as separate countries today. But in ancient North America, again, that border wouldn't have been any more real than the man on the moon. I mean, this is simply an idea, and it is one that is a modern idea. And nonetheless, we seem to be beholden to that. That's a separate country, and I think deeply rooted in our minds. Even if we're looking at things archaeologically, we think, but again, for me to drive down the road or drive from North Carolina to California seems more likely because it's easier to do within the conventions of modern society, whereas if I go to Mexico, I've got to pass into another country. I've got to be able to have a passport to be able to prove my citizenship in one country. There are stipulations about what I can do when I travel into another country. I do think sometimes that deep down, those kinds of modern cultural ideas influence the way that we think about contact that might have occurred in the ancient world. And we seem to think of, again, the southeastern United States as we know it today and Mesoamerica as being, a world away. It might as well be on another planet. But quite obviously, there was trade that was going on. And like you mentioned, finding, at much further inland, Central American sites, we're finding shells that obviously came from the coasts. These people were getting around. They were interacting with one another. So let's remove some of those artificial barriers and just say, look, people were probably looking for material resources that either were necessary to living or that were enjoyable, like coca. If we can enjoy something that tastes delicious and people that far south have got it, but we can bring them something that they'll find appealing, and we can trade and engage in exchange of information, knowledge, culture, materials. It obviously happened. People in the ancient world wanted these things, and they did these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could go over time and time again, example after example of these things. Macaw feathers in the southwest of the United States. Obviously not going to be there originally. Those are coming from the south, the cocoa that we talked about before. And then, you can't overlook things of the infrastructure that we know existed. So look at the roads that the Inca created. Vast amounts of roads over hundreds and hundreds of miles that are still usable today. Even looking at, things like the Roman road, different continent, different group of people, but still something that was put into an infrastructure to accommodate trade and movement of soldiers and just all these different things that you need to have a prosperous society. And so ultimately, whether it would be long distance trade, basically like trade posts that would have been set up where they would move materials from one group to another, and maybe each group only had a short distance that they needed to travel to pass it off to the next group of traders, could be that, or you could have had trade parties that moved over, extensive amounts of period of time and distance in order to trade these different materials. Ultimately, we're left to speculate a lot about the distances that were traveled, but they also used waterways. We're looking at river systems, streams, tributaries, in addition to moving over the land itself. But we know one thing for sure is that these people understood economic gain. They understood the importance of having individual raw materials and individual pieces of art from different areas. And these things were connected in some way, shape, or form. So it's not outlandish to think that along with the tangible products that were being traded, the religious and the spiritual practices and traditions would be carried along as well. And I think that's how we can see some of these points being diffused throughout different cultures. It's just a matter of how much and when.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there have to be limitations placed on things. And I think that part of the bad taste that was left in the mouths of professional archaeologists with regard to the idea of diffusion, trade, and contact between different cultures had to do with the prevalence of the largely pseudo-archaeological idea of hyperdiffusionism that was so popular in the early part of the last century. And so, again, you have an idea that comes out like that, and it is so widely contested by professional archaeologists, and therefore any hint at an idea along those lines sometimes has a stigma attached to it. And so I would say that as much as we look at imaginary geographic boundaries, we have to look at those kinds of boundaries that we place in terms of stigmas on certain ideas in a measured way, with deep analysis and with proper information to back it. I think it's okay to speculate. One thing I appreciated, of course, about our conversation with Dr. Carballo, and he said, I'm speculating, but now here are the things that I know. And again, who better to know these things than an expert who has spent more than, actually right at now, 2 decades in the field studying this. But some of the other takeaways that we had from this conversation, Jason, he had mentioned something about, how at one point he mentioned that climatologists who were studying aspects of that environment needed to confer with archaeologists who are able to lend very valuable supplemental data to the exact dating of occurrences in that region. And he says that they're still outdating often very outdated statistics from old textbooks, I think is how he put it, with regard to climate events that occurred in that region. This is one of those reasons I think that the interdisciplinary approach is so important. And often you see people getting stuck with tunnel vision where they're thinking one way in relation to their field of expertise, and they don't look at outside sources of information from other disciplines. There needs to be harmony and continuity and communication, more importantly, between these to get the full picture.
It's an absolute must. It's something that has to be done. And we're seeing more and more of that. We're now beginning to see the world of archaeology utilizing more geologists, more climatologists, people who are able to look at the finite pieces of a site, whether it be pollen, whether it be DNA from human remains, whatever it is. All of these things are coming together to build a stronger foundation for the science and understanding of these past cultures. It's something that we are very big here on at Seven Ages, is speaking with different disciplines, different scientific backgrounds, and when that's represented within the core of Seven Ages itself, as we have various disciplines within our own core group within Seven Ages. One more thing that we can definitely say that we learned here today is being able to speak with Dr. Carballo. We see a true opportunity to again expand the realm of what Seven Ages covers. So one of our goals for 2019 that we discussed on the live show was to get more international people involved, more sites of international renown involved, and that's what we're going to continue to do throughout 2019. And I have to say, I think this interview today and the site of Teotihuacan is no better way to do so.
I would agree, my friend. I concur wholeheartedly. Well, it's about that time. One more for the road, because you and I actually have some travel ahead of us, as Seven Ages often does. With spring upon us and heading into the warmer season, we intend to go to lots of different places, and we will keep you guys up to date on where we go and where we've been along the way right here on this podcast. It is the Seven Ages Audio Journal, and on behalf of all of my colleagues right here in the Crosstime Pub, we bid you guys adieu until next time.